My name is Jennifer Christensen. I am an upper school English teacher at Christ Presbyterian Academy. Thank you guys so much for letting me come in and discuss our anchor text today, which is James 1:16 through 27. This text is commonly referred to as the be doers of the word, not hearers of the word passage. And we're going to look at that a little bit more in depth in a moment. But I want to begin by just addressing and unpacking the genre that James belongs to. First of all, we know it's a general epistle. We know that epistle means missive or letter. We know it's one of the many letters that we have available to us from the New Testament. This one written by James, the half-brother of Jesus. We have evidence from the Gospels that James did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God during his life and ministry, but post-resurrection came to an understanding and acknowledgement and an acceptance of that, then becoming a leader in the church of Jerusalem. We also know that the intended audience for this particular letter was most likely a series of Christian churches around Palestine. The problem for us as a modern audience is trying to connect our understanding of the letter genre to the letters that were written in the first century. You see, we see our letters as more informal conversation between friends, a chat, or a family member keeping another family member apprised of what's going on. But that's not what a letter was to a first century audience, and it wasn't what a letter was to a first century writer. In fact, what we don't understand is the time-consuming nature of writing a letter. We also don't understand how expensive it was to write a letter. Most of our great apostles who were letter writers were having to have scribes and secretaries who would transcribe the material and then in a series of revisions and edits make sure that this particular letter fit the rhetorical practices that were necessary for authenticity. That letter would have had to include a greeting. It would have to have included a designation of audience. There would have had to be a section for Thanksgiving, and there would have had to be the body of the text. And most certainly there would have had to be the signature. These letters had to be authentic because they served such an important purpose for the churches that they ended up in. You see, what's interesting is that these letters would become a vital piece of the worship and the education and the doctrinal understanding for these churches. They weren't seminary leaders. They relied on the apostles and the people who had these divinely ordained pieces of information that could be transcribed and then transmitted throughout the local church. You see, this letter is a doctrinal statement, but truthfully, it is also a literature of witness. Like, it's a historical record. We can look at the words of James and we can see how he's describing the cultural context of Christianity in his day. And we can look through that lens into what it was like to live in that time, what it was like to face those threats, what it was like to understand the cultural nuance. You know, I get kind of tickled to think about what people 1,000 or 2,000 years from now will do when they look back at our transmissions. I mean, you think about it, we're the pioneers of the internet. We were the first people to log on. We were the first people to communicate via a digital platform, first email and then text. We're the first people to engage in social media and communicate with each other on those platforms. Of course, they're going to look into our transmissions with one another to try to figure out what it was like to live in this window. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I joined Facebook in 2008, and that wasn't even the first iteration of Facebook, but occasionally my status updates from early on in my engagement with Facebook will show up in my memory feed. And guys, they're hideous. I mean, one, for example, that just came up about a week ago was, and I wrote this, it was the only thing I wrote that day, in fact, was my blueberry muffins smell delicious baking in the oven. And I'm wondering, did anyone really need to know that? Is there anyone in the world, other than the people that were going to eat those muffins, did they need to know that information? And just think about the photos we're leaving behind, the selfies. I mean, the workout junkies who've taken shirtless selfies in the gym bathroom to show their progress. How many toes at the beach are we leaving behind? How many photos of plated food at restaurants are people going to see 1,000 and 2,000 years from now? I mean, the truth of the matter is, they're just going to think I don't know, we went on vacation, we ate food, and we worked out. That's what they're going to piece together of what it's like to live in 2023. I tell you the truth, they will note a few things about our transmissions. And I want to make this distinction before I go to the actual text of James. They're going to be amazed at the immensity of our messages to one another, just the sheer volume. And they're going to know wholeheartedly that we had way too much leisure time on our hands. Even though we make the assertion that we never have time, we have way too much time. The first time they go into someone's text exchange and see that someone sent 40 memes in one day, they're going to think those people had too much time on their hands. And the second thing they're going to note is the informal language that we use, the slang, the abbreviations. Are they going to have to bring code breakers in just to figure out what we meant by BRB and LOL? Are they going to have to bring hieroglyphic specialists in to see what these memes meant in our emoji speak, right? They're going to see all of that. And thirdly, they are going to note our tone. They're going to see, especially on certain social media platforms, the divisive nature of our communication with one another. And that I want to use that particular element as a transition to James. James has a reputation for being a step on your toes kind of book. In fact, the tone feels harsh and direct. I heard Paige Brown, who is speaking about James in a Bible study, say recently that human beings love by nature inspiration. We love to be inspired. She said, we actually love information. We love to collect it. We love to curate. We love to find things out, discover how things work. But by and large, our species hates instruction. It feels condemning. It feels judgmental. It feels restrictive. And the truth of the matter is, when we look into what James is trying to assert here, he is essentially asserting the alignment of our stated beliefs with our behavior. He is asking us to consider our creed and to see if it matches our deed. You see, the Christians of his day were maligned by false teachers. They also had to encounter false doctrine. They were trying to decipher what the true message of the gospel really was. We see this inclusion of all of these false beliefs, and James is asking these Christians to draw that very clear line between those who would be fashionably or culturally Christian versus those who would be authentic. And in the passage that we've been given to look at today, he's given us a few warnings, things that we can look at, behavioral directives, so to speak, where we can pull those out. We can take a look and see if our faith is actually synced up to our behavior. In the first one, we see it in James 1:16. It starts out with a warning. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. James is asking these Christian churches to consider the finished work of Jesus Christ, that God is the covenant maker, that He has seen this covenant through to Christ's sacrifice on the cross and His resurrection, that God is the author, and that this particular work we should respond to in kind because He is the one that brings all good gifts to bear. And by doing so, we become set apart from those cultures that we live in. The second thing that he admonishes us for is in James 19. He says, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. He is calling us to an inspection of our self-control, our ability to listen, our ability to quell the noise of the culture that we're living in. We don't want our particular divisiveness to contribute to the wickedness that we're surrounded by and the rampant wickedness that he talks about in the passage. In James 1:22, probably the most famous section of this passage, he says, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. In fact, he goes on in that same section to say, the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer but forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. I'll never forget, one Sunday morning I was traveling to church with my son Luca, who was probably about 5 or 6 years old at the time. And we'd gotten off the exit ramp and we were a little late, so I was hurried, and I got into the end of the exit ramp and stopped at the red light. And beside us, right beside us, was a man who was obviously in need. And he had a sign, and his sign was declaring what his issues were, and he was taking up money. And I'll never forget, this little voice comes from the back of the car, and Lucas says, Mom, Does that man really need help? And I paused for a moment because I thought the way that I answer this question is going to in part inform Lucas' perspective on poverty. It's going to inform his perspective on servanthood. I mean, here we are on the way to church, passing by a man who needs help. Does our behavior, do our actions align with what we say we believe? This is what James is calling us to in this passage. And lastly, one of my favorite parts of the passage is James 1:27. He defines what is to be true religion. Listen to this. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. This idea of reaching out to people in need, to extending our resources toward those who don't have resources, to recognizing those who have been marginalized or disenfranchised, those who have no parents, those who have no spiritual parents, that we are to move towards these people, that is the true expression of a life transitioned into a full acceptance of Jesus Christ's sacrifice. You see, the truth is, in closing, James made the case that living in alignment with God's moral law is an indicator, it is a metric for a living faith. And guys, truthfully, that's the kind of living faith we're going to need in this particular culture to build the kingdom that God has called us to. You guys have a great day.